Good day, everyone watching me out there. Welcome to my channel. Please, if you are new to this channel, kindly subscribe, like, share our videos to support us. Thank you. Okay, so we are going to talk about vampires, how they emerged, what you think about vampires, or what you need to know about vampires. Also, the traits of the modern day vampires are pretty well established. They have fangs, drink human blood, and can't see themselves in mirrors. They can be warded off with garlic or killed with a stake through the heart. Some, like Dracula, are aristocrats who live in castles. But vampires didn't start out so clearly defined. Scholars suspect that the modern conception of these Halloween monsters evolved from various traditional beliefs that were held throughout Europe. These beliefs centered around the fear that the dead, once buried, could still harm the living. Often, these legends arose from a misunderstanding of how bodies decompose. As a corpse's skin shrinks, its teeth and fingernails can appear to have grown longer, and as internal organs break down, a dark pag fluid can leak out of the nose and mouth. People unfamiliar with this process would interpret its fluid to be blood and suspect that the corpse had been drinking it from the living. You can read an archaeologist suspect vampire burial, an undead premiere. Bloody corpses weren't the only cause for suspicion. Before people understood how certain diseases spread, they sometimes imagined vampires were behind the unseen forces slowly ravaging their communities. The one constant is the evolution of vampire legend has been its close association with disease. Trying to kill vampires or prevent them from feeding was a way for people to feel as though they had some control over disease. Vampires of Europe. Because of this, vampire scares tended to coincide with the outbreak of the plague. In 2006, archaeologists unearthed a 16th century skull in Venice, Italy, that had been buried among plague victims with a break in its mouth. The break was likely a burial tactic to prevent strega, Italian vampires or witches, from leaving the grave to eat people. You can read Vampire of Venice, Unmasked, Plague Victims and Witch. Not all vampires were thought to physically leave their grave. In the northern Germany, the Naxera, or after devourers, stay in the ground, chewing on their burial shrouds. After these beliefs likely has to do with peg fluid, which could cause the shroud to sag or tear, creating the illusion that a corpse had been chewing it. These stationary masticators were still thought to cause trouble above ground and were also believed to be most active during outbreak of plague. In the 1679 tract on the chewing dead, a Protestant theologian accused the Naxera of harming their surviving family members through occult process. He wrote that people could stop them by exhuming the human and stuffing its mouth with soil and maybe a stone and a coin for good measure. Without the ability to chew, the tract claimed the corpse would die of starvation. Tales of vampires continued to flourish in southern and eastern European nations in the 17th and 18th centuries, to the chagrin of some leaders. By the mid-18th century, Pope Benedict XIV declared that vampires were fallacious fictions of human fantasy, and the Habsburg ruler Maria Theresa condemned vampire beliefs as superstition and fraud. Still, anti-vampire efforts continued, and perhaps most surprisingly of all, one of the last big vampire scares occurred in 19th century New England, 2 centuries after the infamous Salem witch trial. From the old world to the new. In 1892, 19-year-old Mercy Brown of Exeter, Rhode Island, died of tuberculosis, then known as consumption. Her mother and sister were already dead, and her brother Edwin was sick. Concerned neighbors worried that one of the recently deceased Brown women might be harming Edwin from the grave. When they opened Mercy Brown's grave, they found blood in her mouth and her heart, and took this to be a sign of vampirism. Though they didn't call it that, the neighbors burned Mercy's heart and mixed the ashes into a potion for Edwin to drink, a common anti-vampire tactic. The potion was meant to heal him. Instead, he died a few months later. This wasn't an isolated incident. Folklorists and food for the dead author Michael Bell estimates that there are 16 known examples of anti-vampire rituals in 19th and 18th century, New England, and several other elsewhere in the country. These rituals were most common in eastern Connecticut and western Rhode Island, said Brian Carroll, a history professor at Central Washington University, who is writing a book on the subject. Carroll believes these anti-vampire rituals were introduced as a medical procedure at the time of the American Revolution by German doctors who worked for the Hessian force. Because of this, he thinks the New England vampire were based on the German Exera. Unlike blood-sucking Romanian vampires, New England's vampires stayed in their grave, harming the living through sympathetic magic from afar, he argues. Bell, however, believes anti-vampire practice in New England came from many places and that they suspected New England vampires were actually more akin to Romanian vampires than the Naxera. Like Romanians, New Englands were looking for liquid blood in the virtual organ, not evidence of shroud chewing. He says the anti-vampire remedy of cutting the heart out, burning it to ashes, and giving the ashes to the skin to the sick person or sick people who also practice in Romania. Whatever the source of these beliefs in New England, they were driven by the same social concern as those before them, a fear of disease and a desire to contain it. Still, anti-vampire efforts continued, and perhaps most surprising of all, one of the last big vampire scares occurred in 19th century New England, 2 centuries after the infamous Salem witch trial. Post-vampire. During the vampire panic in New England, vampires were finding a new role in European books like The Vampire, 1890, Camilla, 1871-72, and Dracula, 1897, as well as in vampire-themed plays. Though drawn from folk legends and past vampire scares, these aristocrat sexual vampires were more like the vampires we know today. Vampire panics died down in the 20th century as these fictional monsters replaced folk beliefs and as a medical knowledge improved. However, there was a strange resurgence in the late 1960s when in Manchester, the president of the British Occult Society, and that a vampire was causing people to see strange things in London's Highgate Cemetery. Newspapers had already covered reports of a tall figure with burning eyes and other spectral sights floating the cemetery, and journalists quickly picked up Manchester theory that these sightings were the work of an Eastern European vampire. Newspapers even embellished his claim a bit, calling the figure a king vampire, or writing that the vampire had practiced black magic in Romania before traveling to London in his coffin. In 1970, Manchester told the TV news team that he planned to exorcise the vampire on Friday the 13th. That night, hundreds of young people turned up at Highgate Cemetery to see him perform an exorcism, which he ended up not doing. The Highgate panic wasn't a case of vampire being scapegoated for disease, but rather a media sensation and an instance of legend tripping. Young people going to a supposedly haunted place to rest their bravery. In the history of vampire legend, the Highgate incident is a modern phenomenon. It has less to do with the desire to control a community's health and a lot more in common with modern scares, like the creepy clown sightings that went viral this year. Even if people don't believe it, they're still drawn to the hype. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Make sure to subscribe. See you again next time. Bye bye.